Good night to all. Good night to all. Good night to all. Good night to all. You, can you hear me well? Is it loud and clear? Alternate views. Welcome to the program today. I am your host, Kemar Stuart, and I want to welcome you all to the show. Just let me know if you can hear me clearly. If you're experiencing any challenges on the audio, please let me know as soon as possible that I may have that fixed and therefore remedied. So I am on tonight alternate views, and I will ask persons or me while I'm on the live stream, please. Any questions, you can write in your questions. However, please do not call while we're on the stream. So, without further ado, let us welcome the early Patreon supporters, Fabian Yard, Patrick Designs. Welcome to Alternate Views. I am your host, Kemar Stuart, and Nigel will be on later in the evening, work permitting. So, good night to Nigel. Good night to Mr. Angel. Saying good night, everyone. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to alternate viewers. So those persons who are not subscribers to alternate views, please go on and subscribe to the live stream that we can share perspectives every Thursday. Now, this show is merely based off economics, but there's often a tie between economics and what we call politics or the political system, we should say. So this evening in particular, we want to discuss a very important topic, and that important topic is the Constitution of Barbados. Do we have a constitution, or do we don't have a constitution? Right? That is a question that is being asked widely. So I saw, well, this is not NMP night. This is alternate views. So let me. I don't know what will cause that trick. But tonight is alternate views. Tuesday with NMP nights. So as I was saying, tonight is about constitution or lack thereof. Or lack thereof. So do we or don't we have a constitution of Barbados? Right. Um, this question is on the lips of many. This question I see Mark Adamson on his Facebook post um, asking the question: does Barbados have a constitution, or Barbados, or doesn't it? Now we're going to answer that question tonight. Right? We're going to answer that question tonight in fine detail. So before we get started, just want to encourage you all to like and share the program. To like and share the program. Tonight promises to be packed with information. So I want you all to follow, and I also want other persons as well to be able to come on to this program and learn. This is about lifelong learning. So share it wide, like it wide. We're in the midst of a political by-election at the moment, so you understand as it relates to internet traffic, etc. However, the more persons we get on here, the better the conversation goes. Better the conversation goes, and I would want to have as many people in this conversation to ask questions and also to gain feedback. for areas where we might be a bit shallow in terms of information. So, welcome you all again. Good night to the Caribbean Progress Studies Institute. Good night to Lifelong Learning. Good night to all of the audience on Alternate Views. So we have a bit of rain at the moment. It is very rainy in Barbados over the last couple of days. So I want to ask you people, how are you faring within this weather? How are you faring within this rain? How's it going for you? Um, it has been going okay for me. I know persons who are experiencing severe weather conditions, um, blocked in ways and walkways, um, overflowing drains and flooding. Persons are having that challenge right now. So I am just asking the general public on here, how are you getting through with the rain? And if you're having any challenges with this rain that is falling in Barbados over the last couple of days. So as was said tonight on the program, we are discussing the Constitution of Barbados. And do we have a constitution or do we not have a constitution? Hey, do we have one or do we not have one? That is the question. Now, as usual, we start with a quote from the Living Bible. Just one moment, please. Which, you know, just let me know if you can hear my sound clearly. Um, just let me know if you can hear my sound clearly. Let's make sure we get the lighting right so that you can see me on here very clearly without a doubt. Um, yes. So, as I was saying, we usually start with a quote from the Living Bible, paraphrase. So, we are going to randomly select a page as usual, and we go random. So, in a random selection, we are at page 354, and it says here at page 354, Job or Joab, sorry, leads David's army. Right? Joab leads David's army. It says the following spring, and it says that spring was usually the season when wars usually began. Joab led the Israeli army in successful attacks against the cities and villages of the people of Ammon. After destroying them, he laid siege to Rabbah and he conquered that city. Meanwhile, David stayed in Jerusalem. When David arrived on the scene, He removed the crown from the head of King Milcom and placed it upon his own head. It was made of gold, inlaid with gems, and weighed 75 pounds. David also took great amounts of plunder from the city, and he drove the people from the city and set them to work with saws, iron picks, and axes, as was his custom with all the conquered peoples. Then David and all his army returned to Jerusalem. Over at chapter 21 it says, Then Satan brought disaster upon Israel, for he made David decide to take a census. Take a complete census throughout the land and bring me the totals, he told Joab and the other leaders. But Joab objected, and I quote, If the Lord were to multiply his people 100 times, would they not be all yours? So why are you asking us to do this? Meaning to create the census, which is to count the people. Because remember, God gave the instruction to do not count the people. Well, David went ahead and issued the instruction to count the people. And the question came up, why are you asking us to do this? Why must you cause Israel to sin? Right? But the king won the argument, and Joab did as he was told, and he traveled all through Israel and returned to Jerusalem. Now, the population figure which he gave came to about 1,100,000 men of military age and 470,000 in the land of Judah. Right? And God was very displeased with that census, and he punished the country of Israel for when David went ahead and counted those people and created a census against the will of the Lord. So again, David, in his response to the Lord, said, I am the one who has sinned. Please forgive me, for I now realize how wrong I was to do this. Then the Lord said to Gad, David's personal prophet, Go and tell David, the Lord has offered you three choices. Which will you choose? You may have 3 years of famine, 3 months of destruction by the enemies of Israel, or 3 days of a deadly plague, as the angel of the Lord brings destruction to the land. Think over it and let me know what answer to return to the one who sent me. Right? This is a terrible decision to make, David replied, but let me fall into the hands of the Lord rather than into the power of men, for God's mercies are very great. Right? So even in disobedience to the Lord still, you know, had David's back to a point upon he disobeyed and counted those people. And because of that mistake, then he had three choices to make. And as you could clearly see, all three choices were very difficult choices to make. So, as usual, whatever wisdom this story passes on to you, so let it be, and let the power of the Lord work for you. Thank you. And that was taken from First Chapter Chronicles, First Chronicles 21. Right, so First Chronicles 21. So for those persons who want to go on and read, so be it. Since we're dealing with the Republic of Barbados and the Constitution tonight, it is quite the thing if we could introduce alternate views, the book, right? Alternate views. So as you know, the name of the book, Alternate Views, right? Alternate Views, Barbados' Economic Road to Republic, right? Economic Road to Republic. And the book goes on to say that this is an extraordinary piece of research which gave you the period between 2018 up until 2021 when Barbados declared itself a republic in the midst of the COVID pandemic. So a republic was so special about a republic. Um, Because tonight we can't quote from alternate views because alternate views deals with the economy. Tonight we are dealing with the Constitution of Barbados. So, as you all know, the Constitution of Barbados is a document which sets up the laws, of the land, the laws that we live by daily. The law of the land is the Constitution of Barbados, and every society, every civil society, should have a constitution, be as verbal, right? Verbal or written. It could be verbal or written. Right? So Barbados having a so-called written constitution, right? Let's just do a brief history on it. Let's do a brief history on it. And this is going to be very important, people. Very important. So let me show you what is the Constitution of Barbados. You don't want this one as yet. Right, we want this one here, which is called the Constitution of Barbados. Right, the Constitution of Barbados. So hoping all persons can see on alternate views tonight the Constitution of Barbados. So it says here, as we all should notice, that the Constitution is the supreme law of the country. Right? The supreme law of the country. So Barbados, it gives we'll go through, we're not gonna go through each chapter as to the content, but we just want to give you the table of contents for the Constitution of Barbados. Right? So it says here, chapter 2. Chapter 1, the Constitution. Chapter 2 deals with citizenship. Okay, so persons who are born on the 30th of November 1966 all became Barbadians on that date, and they ceased being British citizens on this date. Right? So when this constitution here that we're looking at, right, when this constitution here that we're looking at was passed in 1966, persons who, on November 30th, 1966, they all lost their British citizenship. Not everybody, but some majority of the population of Barbados lost their British citizenship, and then we all became Barbadians. So it gave you the different details here as to how you could become a citizen of Barbados. So it speaks to persons who are entitled to be registered as citizens. Right? It speaks to persons born in Barbados after the 29th of November 1966 and how you will refer to them. Right? It deals with Barbados' diplomats, people born outside of Barbados, marriage to citizens to Barbadians, renouncing citizenship, Commonwealth citizenship, powers of our parliament, right? And the interpretation of this constitution. So chapter 3 of the Constitution of Barbados deals with the protection of the fundamental rights and freedoms of the individual, right? So fundamental rights and freedoms of the individual, protection of the right to life, right? Protection of the right to personal liberty, protection from slavery and forced labor, protection from inhumane treatment or inhuman treatment, protection from the deprivation of property, protection against arbitrary search or entry, provisions to secure protection of law, protection of the freedom of conscience, protection of the freedom of expression, meaning free speech, which is very important, protection of the freedom of assembly and association, meaning that you are free to associate and assemble whatever groups or groupings you wish, protection of the freedom of movement, protection from the grounds of discrimination or race, etc., the enforcement of protective provisions, time of emergencies, savings of existing law, which is the savings law clause, again, and the different interpretations. So, chapter 4 of this constitution, which was revoked in 2021, right? So, this particular constitution was revoked in 2021 because it says here clearly in chapter 4 of the Constitution of Barbados, it speaks to the Governor General. But as far as we know, we do not have a Governor General anymore. We have a president, right? We have a president. So the big song and dance about going to republic was to have a Barbadian head of state, right? A Barbadian head of state. So this is where it gets, and the information starts to flow now, people. So I'm asking you guys to share, share. Let's like and share on WhatsApp, share on Facebook. Right? So we abolished the office of Governor General, but within the old Constitution, this is where I'm quoting from the old Constitution, right? It gives you the different areas that deals with the Governor General, right? So then it goes on at chapter 5 in our Constitution, speaking to the composition of our Parliament, right? So it gives the establishment of the Parliament, it gives the Senate, qualification for membership of the Senate, disqualification for membership of the Senate, tenure of seats of senators, the president and deputy president of the Senate, the House of Assembly, which is the MPs, the Electoral and Boundaries Commission, the staff of the Electoral and Boundaries Commission, the functions of Electoral and Boundaries Commission, and procedures for the review of constituency boundaries and protection of the Electoral and Boundaries Commission from legal proceedings. Okay, so these are things enshrined within our Constitution. Right? So it goes on to speak about the electoral law, speaks about qualification for the House of Assembly, disqualification for membership of the House of Assembly, tenure of seats of members, determination of questions for membership of the Senate and the Assembly, and filling casual vacancies in the Senate and the House of Assembly. Right? So part 2 of that section speaks to the power to make laws. Right? So this is the powers and the procedure of Parliament, particularly the Barbados Parliament, because we're quoting from the Barbados Constitution. It says that it speaks to the alteration of the Constitution. It speaks to the regulation of procedure in Parliament. It speaks to presiding in the Senate, a quorum of the Senate, voting in the Senate, introduction of bills, restriction on the powers of the Senate as to money bills, restriction on the powers of the Senate as to bills other than money bills, right? And different provisions relating to those three sections, 54, 55, and 56. They're all on the screen there for you, right? So this basically shows you that the Senate is a rubber stamp position, right? So the Constitution is a very long document, right? We can't go through all of these headings, right? But I want to look at this thing here, which speaks to the Caribbean Court of Justice, the CCJ, the Supreme Court, and the Magistrates Court. I want you guys to remember this section about the courts, because this is going to become very important as we proceed through the presentation. So you will see the origin of the court system in Barbados and the origin of this entire constitution as well, and you would see the infrastructure of Barbados, right? So it speaks to the Caribbean Court of Justice, the constitution of the CCJ, appointment of judges, removal of judges, etc., etc. So I'm encouraging persons to get a copy of the Constitution of Barbados. Right. So here we have this Constitution, which was passed in 1966. Right. In 1966, which gave us independence. Right. It gave us independence. Right. So remember, Barbados was a colony. Barbados was a colony. Right. Barbados was a colony of Britain. Right. Barbados was a colony of Britain. So remember, Barbados had one dominant political party, although there were other existing parties, but Barbados had one dominant political party around those times, which was the Barbados Labour Party, right? Or what we call the BLP nowadays. So the BLP being the main dominant political party was led by Sir Grantley Adams, right? Sir Grantley Adams. So Sir Grantley Adams, who was the leader of the Barbados Labour Party around those eras, we will say around the early 1950s, before Barbados became independent. Sir Grantley Adams was the premier of Barbados, right? He was the premier of Barbados. So these premiers basically established or derived their power from being British subject, right? So the premier was basically the person who would, back and forth and in between the British and the country, the leader of the country. It was called a premier at the time. So Errol Walton Barrow joined the Barbados Labour Party. Errol Walton Barrow was elected to the House of Representatives to serve the St. George North constituency, or the St. George constituency, which is now we call St. George North, right? So Errol Barrow was in the parliament with Grantley Adams, who was the premier of Barbados. Right? Barbados did not receive its independent status as yet, but Barbados was part of what you call the West Indies Federation. Right? The West Indies Federation. Right? The West Indies Federation. So for those persons who want to pull up an app, right? It is called the British Caribbean Federation Act, right? The British Caribbean Federation Act of 1956. So the historians will very much appreciate this conversation. Uh, Persons like Mr. Kemar Stuart, Mr. Bobby Morris, and many of the older stalwarts who know the history of Barbados would appreciate this conversation. So let me write it in here. The British Caribbean Federation of 1956. Right. So I put it in the comments there that everyone can see. The British Caribbean Federation Act of 1956. Right. So to quote a bit of what this British Caribbean Federation Act of 1956 means it derived what you call the West Indies Federation, right? Or the West Indies Federation. So you have many people in the Caribbean who would run around calling themselves West Indians, right? Calling themselves West Indians. The word West Indian was directly handed down by the British, right? The word or the terminology West Indies, right? So it says here the West Indies Federation. So it says established in 1958, the West Indies Federation comprised the 10 territories of Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Dominica, Grenada, Jamaica, Montserrat, Saint Kitts, Nevis, Anguilla, Saint Lucia, Saint Vincent, Trinidad and Tobago. And the federation was established by the British Caribbean Federation Act of 1956. Right? My screen dropped off. I don't know what happened there. Right? So I gave you those countries. And what's interesting about those countries, those are all CARICOM, or today we call CARICOM countries. Right? So I hope you understand, alternate viewers, right? That what you call the Caribbean or what you call CARICOM today, the history of CARICOM is rooted in, or deep rooted in British political history. Right? So here you have it, the British Parliament passing an act called the British Caribbean Federation Act of 1956 with the aim of establishing a political union among its members. Right? So today, these same countries that I all listed, Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Dominica, Grenada, Montserrat, St. Kitts, Anguilla, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Trinidad and Tobago, are all we call a modern day Caribbean community, right? But look at the history of it. So then it goes on to say that the federal government, right, was headed by an executive governor general, right? The federal government was headed by an executive governor general appointed by Britain. Right? So the federal governor general was appointed by Britain. He had responsibility for all of the British colonies within the Caribbean, which were brought to bear under this particular act, as you can see on my screen right now. Right? I would like to get it bigger that you can see. Perfect. Right? So all of those Caribbean countries were brought under being by this particular act. Right? I remember they all had premiers, not prime ministers. So this executive governor general that Britain put in place to govern the colonies, right? This photo that you can see here is a photo which is from within port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, right? This is within the Trinidad and Tobago legislature. And the person you can see right here is Princess Margaret, right? Princess Margaret. So what's special about Princess Margaret and Barbados? There's an entire school in Barbados named after Princess Margaret, right? So that is included in the parish of St. Philip, right? The Princess Margaret School. So let me just read the caption under the picture. It says here that the view of this chamber during the inauguration of the federal legislature of the West Indies, the ceremony, officiated by Princess Margaret, brought into formal being the newest member of the British Commonwealth, i.e., the West Indies Federation. Right. So it says here, seated to the left of the princess in this photo is Lord Hills, Governor General of the Federation. Right. And this was just 1956, Right. This was 1956. So that's 10 years exactly. Right. That's 10 years exactly before independence. Right. So 10 years before independence, we had Princess Margaret along with the governor, who was Lord Hills, appointed by Britain to oversee the British colonies within the Caribbean, or what we call West Indian countries. Right? So the quote here, oh, I should tell you, by the way, I'm quoting from CARICOM's website. So you can go on and look, as you see, CARICOM, a community for all. I'm quoting from CARICOM's website. So it goes on to say here that, and it gives some of the structure for what was the federation at that time, right, or what was called the West Indies Federation at that time. So it said here that a prime minister elected from among and by the members of the House of Representatives, right, meaning that they had to choose a prime minister from among the different territories who would be the head, right. Then there would be a cabinet comprising the prime minister and 10 other elected members chosen by him, right, and then a state council provided over by the governor general. So then it gave a list of rules here, but we don't want to get too deep in the rules. It then went on to say here, right, that the governor general was Lord Hills of Britain, and that the Prime Minister was Grantley Adams, Sir Grantley Adams, who's on our $100 bill, right? He was Premier of Barbados, and the Federation capital was located in Trinidad and Tobago, right? So you all will know that within CARICOM, CARICOM derives its power through the Treaty of Chaguaramas, and Chaguaramas is within Trinidad and Tobago, right? So historically, it shows here that the West Indies Federation, the headquarters was located, or the federal capital, I should say, was located in Trinidad and Tobago, right? However, Grantley Adams, who was Premier of Barbados, he was Prime Minister of the Federation, right? So remember, the Barbados, they were parties in full power at that time, right? With Grantley Adams being the leader, right? It then went on to explain, basically, during the existence of Federation, because Federation was a very brief exercise, huh? So it said during its brief existence, a number of fundamental issues were debated with a view of strengthening the federation. Among those were direct taxation by the federal government, right? Direct taxation by the federal government, central planning for development, and the establishment of a regional customs union and reform of the federal constitution, meaning that they intended to be a regional, or we call, for more modern conversation, a CARICOM constitution. But at that time, it would have been called. eh, At that time, it would have been called the Federation Constitution, because all of the Caribbean countries were under the West Indies Federation. As I just put the name of the act on there that was passed in the British Parliament. Right. So these Caribbean countries were not self-governing at the time. Right. Haiti, Haiti was one of the few Caribbean countries that achieved independence in the 1800s. Right. So Haiti was one of the world's first free black republics. Right. But just the other day in 1958, most of the Caribbean countries still being colonies, still being led by a federal governor general, in association with Princess Margaret, right? During that existence, it spoke to the issues, right? So it went on to say here, right, about the Federation. That the Federation began to quickly establish Federation in federal institutions and the supporting structures, right? So it created what we call a federal civil service, right? So the Caribbean Civil Service established was the West Indies Shipping Services to operate two multi-purpose ships throughout the Caribbean, right? So you had what we call the Federal Maple and the Federal Palm. So these were two ships that were set up to operate throughout the Caribbean. In a more modern time, you hear Caribbean CARICOM leaders speaking about developing a ferry system and having the ferry roll up and down through the Caribbean. Trinidad stepped forward in a big way speaking about this ferry system. So you're seeing the way Trinidad is still playing a very important role today in CARICOM. Right? So here you have those two ships that the Federation bought or took over or whatever, the Federal Maple and the Federal Palm. And these two ships were donated by the government of Canada. Right? It was donated by the government of Canada. Right? The Federation at the time also acquired what we call BV or British West Indies Airways. BV. Y'all can remember BV, right? Who here ever traveled on BV before? Right? Heard the name British West Indies Airways. BWIA. Right? So the Federation embarked on negotiations to acquire BV. Right? And BV ran long after independence. They also attempted to derive what we call tertiary education at the level of federation, right? So then you had the establishment of two colleges. So then it was called the University College of the West Indies, right, which was called the UCWI, right? The UCWI, which was established in Mona, Jamaica, right? So you will hear the term nowadays, the Mona campus in Jamaica, right? It was called the UCWI, University College of the West Indies at Mona campus. And then a second campus was opened at St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago in the year of 1960. Of course, after Errol Barrow became Prime Minister of Barbados, he then established what we now have to be the KFL campus. So these three campuses, which were the first two were derived under the Federation, which was Mona campus and St. Augustine campus, those were institutions of the Federation. Since then, they were renamed to the University of the West Indies, and then the Barbados campus was established at Cave Hill. Right? So, what we're saying, your history, because it's leading up to the point we want to make about Barbados' his constitution. Right? And it says here that the decisive development which caused the destruction or the demise of at that time Federation, right, was the withdrawal of Jamaica. Right? Jamaica withdrew from what you call the British West Indies Federation, and it was its largest member at the time. Huh? So after conducting a national referendum in the year of 1961, Jamaica then pulled out of what we call the West Indies Federation. After Jamaica's withdrawal from the West Indies Federation, this led to a movement within Jamaica for national independence from Britain. I remember they were still colonies, and The countries were not independent. So Jamaica then pushed forward after 1961 to claim or to push for independence from Britain. It also led to what you call the statement by Dr. Eric Williams, who was the premier of Trinidad and Tobago, that 1 from 10 leaves not, referring to the withdrawal of Jamaica as signifying and justifying his decision to withdraw Trinidad and Tobago from the federal government of the Caribbean, or what you call the British West Indies Federation. So Jamaica left first, right? Jamaica left, seeking independence. Then Trinidad left, uh, seeking independence as well. So by the year of 1962, right? By the year of 1962, or thereby close enough, Arrow Barrow, as some others would have been formulating what we call now the Democratic Labour Party. The Democratic Labour Party. So after the Democratic Labour Party was formed, the Democratic Labour Party then went on to win the government, right? Beating up Grantley Adams. And then Barbados as a country, Barbados as a country, right, sought what you call independence, right? Sought what you call independence. But let me just say this for the benefit of our regional brothers and sisters who carry on. Independence was never an exercise fought for, right? It was something that was derived. It was something that was derived by Britain, right? It was something that was derived by Britain as what we call now the British Federation. Uh, it then morphed into a new piece of legislation passed in the British Parliament, right, called the West Indies Act of 1962, right, of 1962 and 1967, right. So hear that the West Indies Act was passed in the British Parliament, right, and that particular act played a significant role in the political developments in the Caribbean, right. So after Federation collapsed, right, after the Federation collapsed, the British then went to Parliament and passed the West Indies Act of 1962, right, and this act allow for the cessation or the shutdown or the winding down or the end of the British Caribbean Federation. Right? And allow for the establishment of what you call common courts and the new form of government for West Indies colonies. Right? And the act also granted the status of associate states to several islands, granting them full internal self-governance, while the United Kingdom retained responsibility for the country's external affairs and for their defense. So again, the West Indies Act, right? The West Indies Act of 1962 and 1967 granted the status for the British colonies in the Caribbean to have full internal self-government, while Britain or England retained responsibility for the external affairs, the foreign affairs, and defense, right? So, as a little Caribbean country, you don't have to run into any trouble. Britain will come to your aid for military and defense. Very often, Britain protected their colonies with their armies wherever they are in the world. India was a colony of Britain, right? India was a colony of Britain, right? Canada. So it was not just smaller countries, but some of these larger countries were also colonized, right? So this West Indies Act of 1962 again gave rise to what we call common courts. So it established the courts, it established courts that could hear appeals, right? Appeals from the courts of relevant colonies. It then allowed for the establishment for the government of these colonies, right? And it enabled the establishment of authorities to perform the functions for these colonies, right? And then it allowed for the creation of the new governmental structures for the colonies, right? So, as I said to you, right, this particular act, the West Indies Act of 1962 and 1967, passed in the British Parliament, facilitated what they're called independence, right? Independence for Caribbean territories that allowed them to set up these different structures, right? Allow them to set up these different structures while still associating themselves with Britain, right? So you had what you call the protectorate status. So Britain was still the overall protector, but you went on to set up your own internal self-government structures. So this was not something that was fought for, right? This was not something that was fought for. In fact, the British were willfully passing these legislation in their parliament to allow their colonies to now self-govern, right? So, interesting fact, interesting fact here. It says here that the West Indies and the association status was a collective name for a number of islands in the Eastern Caribbean whose status changed from being British colonies to states in free association with the United Kingdom by the year of 1967. This move was partly to satisfy the United Nations Special Committee on Decolonization, right? Decolonization. And by the time they passed the act, it then gave rise to what we call independent status. So Barbados became an independent country. Right? Barbados became an independent country. Jamaica became an independent country. Trinidad and Tobago became an independent country. And I also think Guyana reached for independence in the 1960s as well. But let me just get that information on here because I want you guys to see it. Right? I want you guys to see it. So the passage of these acts, right, and parliaments through the Caribbean, Barbados passed in 1966 the Independence Act, which then allowed Barrow to become the first prime minister. So remember, Barrow was premier of Barbados, having defeated Grantley Adams. He was premier of Barbados, and after Barbados was given independence, along with these other Caribbean countries that were under the Federation, right? Remember, Barrow in Barbados, Eric Williams in Trinidad. I can't remember if it was Alexander Bustamante at the time in Jamaica. I can't remember in Jamaica. I can't recall at the time, but it was Barbados, Jamaica, right? Jamaica, Trinidad, and Guyana. Those four countries, four bigger countries, uh, in CARICOM, right? In that 1960s era, when they set up the structures, as again I gave you the history, you resting these act passed in the British Parliament, right? So let's reference Barbados. Let's reference Barbados, right? Because we're Bajans. So let's look at Barbados. How Barbados was given, or the process that led to Barbados becoming what we call an independent country. But becoming an independent country, Barbadians then lost the right to claim British citizenship and to claim you know, the respective benefits of being a colony because Barbados was now on its own. So, in the year of 1966, in the British Parliament, right? So, look, I hope you can see this here. Two pieces of legislation was passed. Right? Two pieces of legislation was passed. The Barbados Independence Act of 1966 and the Barbados Independence Order of 1966. Right? You see that? Right? You're seeing that. You're seeing that. So these pieces of legislation were passed in the British Parliament. Right? So again, I don't think that if it was a fight, I don't think that if it was one of those rebel movements that this would have happened. Right? So here are the British saying to the colonies that were under the former federation that we want you to go ahead and establish full self-government. We want you to run your own affairs. Right? Right. Thank you, Tyrone. It was Alexander Bustamante who was in office at the time. So I see my memory is still very much intact. And I believe it was Forbes Burnham, right? I believe it was Forbes Burnham who was in power in Guyana at the time. Right? So it was Errol Barrow of Barbados, Dr. Eric Williams in Trinidad and Tobago, Forbes Burnham in Guyana, and Alexander Bustamante in Jamaica. Right? Those were the four countries leading the charge for independence or the status of independence in the 1960s. So Errol Barrow, in negotiations and conversations with the British, uh, he went up to England. He and whoever, I can't remember the team or the persons who would have went up there. I think, if I'm more sure, I will probably ask one of the historians to tell me who were the members who went up to England. But here we had it, the United Kingdom legislation saying the Barbados Independence Act of 1966 and the Barbados Independence Order of 1966. So let us scroll down. Let us scroll down. So this piece of legislation that we are quoting from is the Barbados Independence Act of 1966. Right? And this was passed. Right? This was passed in the British Parliament. So it says here that the Barbados Independence Act of 1966, the arrangement of the section, and it says here the section creates fully responsible status of Barbados, consequential modifications of British Nationality Act. So remember I told you that when Barbados went to independent status, that who were now calling themselves Barbados, they actually lost their British nationality and they lost the British status and they now became what we call now a Barbadian. So the retention of United Kingdom and colonies by certain citizens of Barbados. So as we said, Not everybody lost the status, but most did. They have the consequential modification of other enactments, the power to provide a new constitution for Barbados, right? Power to provide for a new constitution for Barbados, and the different short titles and interpretations were available. So this act was passed in the British Parliament. Now, I don't see how a small country like Barbados could really actually force the British to pass this, right? I can't see how it's possible that we were forcing them to pass this. Right? So the only thing I can remember at the time was the 1937 riots, the disturbances, right? The disturbances. Then we had the Moyne Commission, and things were fairly cool. Right? Things were fairly cool. Um, things were fairly cool within the Caribbean after those riots. Right? So there was no force. So I want to disavow people's mind from my perspective that there was any fight or any grave, big, massive thing happening at the time. Because I was brainwashed to believe that there was this fight and our forefathers fought for this and fought for that. But clearly here when you read the actual history of Barbados, we're seeing that it was not necessarily so much a fight, but more like a collaboration. So let us go on. Within the schedules of this act passed in England, it said the legislative powers of Barbados, and then it gave the amendments not affecting the law of Barbados. So let us scroll leisurely by. Let us scroll leisurely by. Fabian Yard is asking, are we still under British law? Yes, we are. Very much so. Eh, Very much so, we still are. Ah, so here we have it. So on section, page 3, sorry, of the Barbados Independence Act 1966, at chapter 37, it says here, an act to make provision for and in connection with the attainment by Barbados of fully responsible status within the Commonwealth. It goes on to say, be it enacted by the Queen's most excellent Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Lords Spiritual and Temporal and Commons, and in this present Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same as follows. That on and after the 30th of November 1966, in this act referred to as the appointed day, Her Majesty's government in the United Kingdom shall have no responsibility for the government of Barbados. So let me go back to that one again. This act, the Barbados 1966 Independence Act passed in the British Parliament, says that on and after the 30th of November 1966, Her Majesty's government in the United Kingdom shall have no responsibility for the government of Barbados. It then goes on to say that no act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom passed on or after the appointed day shall extend or be deemed to extend to Barbados as part of its laws, and on and after that day the provisions of Schedule 1 to this act shall have effect with respect to the legislative powers of Barbados. Right? So I'm going to show you guys how we are still under British law, given although these things were passed. It then goes on to say in this act that, except as provided by Section 3, any person who immediately before the appointed day, is as November 30th, is a citizen of the United Kingdom or colonies. We go back. Any person who before the appointed day is a citizen of the UK or colonies shall on that day cease to be a citizen if he becomes on that day a citizen of Barbados. Right? So if you agree to become a citizen of Barbados when Barbados took us to a republic, which also happened at midnight, right? So I know there were some persons who were criticizing the current Barbados Prime Minister for going at midnight, but Barbados also went at midnight, right? So when we went to independent status, you then cease to become a citizen of the United Kingdom and colonies, and you now became a Barbadian. So I hoping that you are thinking about that. I'm hoping, you know, that may mean something to you, right? So you know became a Barbadian. It then gives specification as to who can retain the UK status, etc., etc. But that's not the point of our conversation today. Yeah. So let me just read some of the other important stuff. Because this part here speaks to nationality all over again. So many persons would have been asking at the time, um, how was Barrow able to serve in the British Army? Right. So you will see that the United Kingdom and colonies. It says here that on and after the point that the expression the colony in the Army Act of 1955, the Air Force Act of 1955, and the Naval Discipline Act of 1957 shall not include Barbados. Right? It shall not include Barbados. So remember, Barrow was an Air Force soldier who flew, who he did his thing, etc., etc. So you're clearly seeing here how he was able to be a British soldier, study, become a law barrister in England. Through being a barrister in England or a solicitor, whatever the name was called at that time, um, you could then see the footprints of Arabaro through the information that we're providing here. Right. So then it goes on to say here, ah, here we have it. It speaks to the power to provide, the power to provide a new constitution for Barbados. So remember, this is the 1966 Independence Act passed in the British Parliament. So here the British giving us now the power to provide a new constitution for our country. And I showed you the constitution earlier. It says Her Majesty may, by order in council made before the appointed day, which is November 30th, 1966, provide a constitution for Barbados to come into effect on that day. An order in council under this section, in this section referred to as a constitution order, right? A constitution order may include provision as to the matter in which the legislature of Barbados may alter any provisions of that order, or may alter any law which alters any of those provisions, and a constitution provided by a constitution order may include provision as to the manner in which the legislature of Barbados may alter that constitution or any provisions of that constitution, or may alter any law which alters that constitution. Let me read over that again because it sounds a bit confusing. So the power is to provide a new constitution for Barbados. So Her Majesty may, by order in council, right, an order in council. So let us do a little word etymology. Let us go on the Google. Let's type in order in council. What does it mean? It says here, an order in council is a type of legislation in many countries, especially those within the Commonwealth realms, that is formally made in the name of the monarch, with the advice and consent of the Privy Council. So in the UK, for example, orders in council are made in the name of the king, acting on the advice of the Privy Council. So you guys can remember that most attorneys in Barbados were QCs, right? Most people or most attorneys in Barbados, or the big shot ones, were QCs. I would go as far as saying no, with the exception of Owen Arthur and Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford, all of the other prime ministers were in the Queen's Council, to the inner bar, right? To the inner bar. So, what does the Bar Association really mean? Or what does it mean when you assent to being part of the Bar Association, right? When you sit in the inner bar and you get the title Queen's Counsel, right? It says here, let me pull that up one more time, that an order in council is a type of legislation in many countries, especially Commonwealth countries, that is formally made in the name of the monarch, with the advice and consent of the Privy Council. Now, the final court of appeal is not the Privy Council for Barbados. Barbados respects the CCJ. But for countries like Jamaica, Jamaica still very much respects the Privy Council, right? So most of our prime ministers being part of the Queen's Council, right, being QCs, when they transcend over to a republic, they are no go by the title of King's Council, right? Meaning that they're still very much a part of the monarch. Right? So an order in council is these legislations made in the name of the monarch. So it goes on to say that Her Majesty may by order in council, right? So that's legislation made in the name of the monarch, made before the appointed day, may provide a constitution for Barbados to come into effect. So it clearly says here that based on this legislation passed in the British Parliament, that the Queen, right, that the Queen passed legislation in her name, right, in her name to give Barbados a constitution, therefore establishing a representative on island, i.e., the Governor General, right? So the Governor General being the Queen's representative on the island, right? If you check through all of the countries that were part of the Federation, with the exception of Guyana, who's a republic, with the exception of, right, I think Guyana is the only voted republic in the Caribbean. Right? Dominica is a republic, but Dominica doesn't elect a president. So I think Guyana is only the Guyana. Uh yeah, Guyana. Hey, Guyana is the only place that elects a president. Like, all the others are selected. So it goes on to say here that an order in council. I remember order in council means that a decision made in the name of the queen, who is now the king. Under this section, and it says in brackets, in this section referred to as a constitution order, may provide may include provision as to the manner in which the legislature of Barbados, meaning the Parliament of Barbados now, may alter any provisions of that order. Right? So the order, the constitution that was set up by the Queen, handed down to Barbados, it is now saying here that the Parliament of Barbados, right, the Parliament of Barbados may make and alter any provisions of that order, and may make any law which alters any of those provisions and a constitution provided by a constitutional order, which may include provisions as to the manner in which the Parliament of Barbados may alter that constitution or any provisions of that constitution. Right? So you see where the Parliament of Barbados derived its power from and also derived its constitution from. Right? So then it goes on to say here in this section, references to altering a constitution or to altering any provision or law include references. To revoke it with or without the reenactment thereof, or the making of a different provision in lieu thereof. To modify it, whether by omitting, amending, or overriding any of its provisions, or inserting additional provisions in it or otherwise, and to suspend its operation for any period or terminating any such suspension. A constitutional order may contain such transitional or other incidental or supplementary provisions as appear to Her Majesty to be necessary or expedient. Right? So let me give you that again. It goes on to reference now altering that constitution that Barbados was handed by the British. It says here, right, that to revoke it with or without reenactment or making of different provisions or modifying it by omitting or amending or overriding any of its provisions, to suspend it, its operation for any period of time, a constitution order may contain such transitional or other incidental or supplementary provisions as appear to Her Majesty to be necessary or expedient. Right? So it says you know that a constitutional order, a council, right, could allow the queen or the monarch, right, the powers of revoking it, modifying it, suspending it. You see? Then it goes on to say that any constitutional order shall be laid before Parliament after being made. And this act may be cited as the Barbados Independence Act of 1966, except insofar as the context otherwise requires references to this act or any enactments or references to that enactment or as amended or extended by or under any other enactment. So that's just speaking to references and names also. But this act, Independence Act of 1966, right? So then it speaks to what we call the legislative powers of Barbados. Right? It speaks to know the legislative powers of Barbados. So tune in very carefully now, people. Because we are at approximately 36 persons. So we want to encourage you to like and share this program. Put it in the chats, put it all over because this is very important information. Speaking to the Constitution of Barbados. I don't know if anybody could send this to Mark Adamson, who was a very another serious proponent of this issue. Um, yeah. So it goes on to say here at Schedule 1 of that same Barbados Independence Act of 1966 that the legislative powers of Barbados. So this is not the Parliament of Barbados and how the Parliament of Barbados derives its power. So it goes on to say that the Colonial Laws Validity Act of 1865 shall not apply to any law made on or after the appointed day by the legislature of Barbados. So let us put in on Google the Colonial Laws Validity and see what it says. Colonial, right? Ah, so it says here now that the Colonial Laws Validity Act of 1865 was a British Act of Parliament passed to clarify the relationship between colonial laws and imperial legislation. It addressed concerns about the validity of laws enacted by colonial parliaments and provided that colonial laws were generally valid unless they were repugnant to British law. And this act also defines key terms like what a parliament is nowadays and what is colonial law, right? So it goes on to say that colonial laws were generally valid unless they conflicted with acts of parliament or orders in council. Colonial laws were generally valid unless they conflicted with acts of parliament or orders in council. So here you have it. Barbados' colonial laws were still on the books. Right? Here you have it. Here you have it. So let's go to the source. Right? Let us go to the source. And let us look at what the British are saying about their own legislation. Let's look at what they're saying of their Colonial Laws Validity Act. Again, it sought to clarify the difference between colonial laws and the laws of modern parliaments. Right? Right. So it gives you, this is the British legislative website I'm on, right? So it goes on to say here that colonial law went void for repugnancy. So remember, these colonial laws only become null and void when they are repugnant to British law. So it says here any colonial law which is or shall be in any respect repugnant to the provisions of any act of parliament extending to the colony to which such law may relate, or repugnant to any order or regulation made on the authority of such act of the parliament, right, shall be raised subject to such act, right? It shall be raised subject to such act, order, or regulation, and shall, to the extent of repugnancy, but not otherwise, be and remain absolutely void and inoperative, right? So if you have that conflict, it clearly spells out, you know, whatever. It then goes on to say here, right? It then goes on to say here that no colonial law shall be or deemed to have been void or inoperative on the ground of repugnancy to the law of England, unless the same shall be repugnant to the provisions of some such act of parliament, order, or regulation as aforesaid. Right? So you are clearly seeing here, right? You are clearly seeing here, right? The challenge that Barbados is facing. It then goes on to say that every colonial parliament shall have and be deemed at all times to have had full power within its jurisdiction to establish courts, right? Courts of judicature, and to abolish and to reconstitute the same, and to alter the constitution thereof, right? And to make provision for the administration of justice. So let me go back to that screen that was on. Right. So the Colonial Laws Validity Act, right, shall not apply to any law made on or after the appointed day by the legislature of Barbados. So you hear it. The Colonial Laws Validity Act shall not apply to any law made on November 30th, 1966 or after 1966. So it clearly says here that any colonial laws made before 1966 still remain valid on the books of Barbados. Right? And this is what you call the savings law clause, right? The savings law clause. So, alternate viewers, you can go and put that up in Google and do your own personal reading, right? The right? Savings, let me put it in. Savings law clause, right? The savings law clause. So, this Colonial Laws Validity Act, right, kept the old colonial laws on the books of Barbados, which predate 1966. But after 1966, it clearly says that the act passed in Britain does not apply to any law made on or after the appointed date. It then goes on to say here that no law or no provision of any law made on or after the appointed day by that Parliament shall be void or inoperative on the ground that it is repugnant to the law of England or to the provisions of any act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom, including this particular act, or to any other rule or regulation made under any such act, according to the powers of that Parliament, shall include the power to repeal or amend any such act, order, rule, or regulation insofar as it is part of the law of Barbados. Right? What I say to you people, and it clearly says here that it shall not apply to any law made on or after the appointed day. So the appointed day was Independence 1966, but it doesn't speak to the laws that existed before that time, right? So that allows the savings law clause to maintain itself and its colonial laws, which modern parliaments in Barbados have used to hold down people, right? And are at the same type of colonial laws because they're still on the books, right? So our lovely kings councils and those people, right? They still very much utilize these old colonial laws, right? I remember I'm not quoting from any Barbadian. I'm quoting from legislation that was passed in the British Parliament. So this legislation is still very much active, but it clearly shows you here that the Parliament of Barbados derives its own power to make its own laws and to amend and to repeal and to do all of these things. However, this piece of legislation here says that it comes into effect after 19. So you could change any law after 1966. Right? You could change any law after 1966 without necessarily referencing uh, British law or the law of England or anything of the sort. But when you go before that time, then the ball game changes. It then goes on to say that the legislature of Barbados shall have full power to make laws having extraterritorial operation. Right? Right. So this here now speaks to the Colonial Court of Admiralty. Right. So it says here that the Colonial Court of Admiralty, which requires certain laws to be reserved for the signification of Her Majesty's pleasure, are to contain a suspending clause as so much of Section 7 of that Act as requires the approval of Her Majesty in Council to any rules of court for regulating the practice and procedure of a colonial court of admiralty shall cease to have effect in Barbados. So the colonial court of admiralty ceased to have effect in Barbados. Ah, so it then goes on to say here, it speaks to, sorry, about the Caribbean and the North Atlantic territories. So as you can see here, the Parliament of Barbados passed the Barbados Independent, not Parliament, sorry, British, passed this piece of legislation, the Barbados Independence Order of 1966, and it says here, at the court of Buckingham Palace, the 22nd day of November 1966. It says, Present, the Queen's most excellent Majesty in Council, Her Majesty by virtue and exercise of the powers vested in her by Section 5 of the Barbados Independence Act 1966, and all of the other powers enabling her in that behalf, is pleased by and with the advice of her Privy Council to order, and it is hereby ordered as follows. Right. This order may be cited as the Barbados Independence Order of 1966. This order shall come into operation on the 30th of November 1966, referred to as the appointed day, provided that the governor may at any time after the 22nd of November 1966 exercise any powers conferred upon the Governor General. By sections 4 and 10 of this order and section 60 and 90 and section 60, 89, 90 and 91 of the Constitution settled in the schedule to this order. Right? That is important. So you need to remember that. It says here that the Constitution of Barbados is settled in the schedule to this order. In this order referred to as the Constitution, right? To such extent as may, in his opinion, be necessary or expedient to enable the Constitution to function from the appointed day. Now, Patrick Designs is saying that El Barrow had drafted a new constitution stipulated for Barbados to, to to be deemed as a republic, but he lost the election and the BLP shelved it. So this election, this is probably the 1976 election that you're speaking about, right? This is the 1976 election you're speaking about, right? So it says here now that the Constitution of Barbados was settled in the schedule to the order, right? So the order is the Barbados Independence Order of 1966. So the Constitution of our country is settled within the schedule of that order, right? So remember that that order was passed in the British Parliament, right? And that order then derived what we call the legislature of Barbados, or the Parliament, or the newly restructured Parliament of Barbados, right? The Constitution was settled in a schedule within that order. So Barbados never really had a standalone constitution per se. Um, yeah, Barbados never had like which is strange, but good. So this order then goes on to say that for the purposes exercised by the governor under the provision to subsection of the powers conferred by these different sections, the references therein refer to the Prime Minister and the Leader of Opposition, and it shall be construed as if they were references respective to what they called before the Premier and to the Leader of Opposition. Right? Right. It then spoke here briefly. Right. It then speak here briefly. It then speaks here briefly about the British Caribbean Court of Appeal. Right. It speaks to the British Caribbean Court of Appeal in Council. So you hear that again. The British Caribbean Court of Appeal in Council. Right? 1962. Right? So you have this British Caribbean Court of Appeal, right? But remember, Barbados now respects the CCJ, and not necessarily the Privy Council anymore. Wait, and then went on to say here, Pedro, that subject to the provisions of this order, which is the Barbados Independence Order of 1966, it says that the Constitution shall come into effect on the appointed day. Right? I remember the Constitution of Barbados was included within the schedule, and the schedule was included within the order, and the order was passed in the British Parliament. Right? So if it is that Alvaro did go ahead to bring a Republican Constitution, that was visionary. That would have been the way to go, because the original Constitution, as we could clearly see from this piece of legislation, was handed down to us as an order and council in the name of the Queen. Right? So then it goes on to say here, subject to the provision of this section, the existing laws shall be construed with such modifications, adaptations, qualifications, and exceptions as may be necessary to bring them into conformity with the Barbados Independence Act of 1966 and this order. Right? Mm. And then it goes on to say here, right? Now, for those persons who might be a historian, I would very much love to know who was the Governor General of Barbados in 1965, 66. So if one of the alternate viewers could go on and give me that information, I'd be very happy. Um, yeah. So I am trying to get to the part where it says, right, right. I'm trying to find here the Constitution. Ah, if you say Sir John Stow, now the Governor General of Barbados had the authority and the power to, again, the power of the Queen to, to amend any of these existing laws, right? This was the colonial laws, to bring it into conformity with the Barbados Independence Order that was passed in the British Parliament. So all of those older laws, which could have been amended to suit the more modern times, the Governor General, as someone is saying, Sir John Stow. So Sir John Stow had the power at that time to amend any and all laws to bring it into conformity, right? To bring it into conformity with this new order. And as I said, the order then derived what we now have as a constitution, right? So I don't want to necessarily go into what Sir John Stow did or did not do while he was the thing, because I don't have the facts. So would not go down that rabbit hole. I would seek someone more senior than me who would have that information to come and speak. on those issues if we could find persons around with that history. Mm, yeah, no, we practice Westminster politics in Barbados. So I am hoping, alternate viewers, that you clearly see um, why and how, like, how and why the British imprint, the British imprint was all over Barbados' political system, or what you call the legislature. Right? We practice the same style of Westminster politics. Right? Barbados maintains the Westminster style, and you're clearly seeing how and why. Now, Lemuel Tell is saying laws which predate the Constitution remain in force unless they are repealed by the Parliament of Barbados. Also, a UK government could get crazy one day and pass a law to reverse independence. Now, this is exactly what we were saying all along, Lemuel, that the Barbados Independence Order was passed in the British Parliament. And it is the British Parliament which gave the Barbados legislature, through this same order, its power. So before 1966, we had colonial parliaments. Right? So the first post-colonial uh, parliament we had was constructed and ran on, as was said earlier, an order in council, right? Meaning in the name of the monarch or the queen. Right? Now, you say that it remains in force unless they are repealed by the Parliament of Barbados. Now, we would have said earlier on the live, right, that there's something called the Savings Law Clause, right? And we also spoke about the Colonial Laws Validity Act, right, which says that the laws, right, which come, right, the laws which come before 1966 remain intact. But if any of the laws after 1966 come into conflict or so, they don't necessarily have to be repugnant to British law. It does not have to reflect or respect British law if it comes after 1966. But because of the Colonial Validities Act of 1865 in England, right, they, no Parliament of Barbados, right, no Parliament of Barbados can repeal these savings law clauses, right, under the system that we had before. Right? So, with Barbados still being a Commonwealth country, I still very much enjoying the status of being within the Commonwealth realm. I don't see it being practical, plausible, or will it happen with these politicians that we have in the Caribbean, right? These politicians who are very much pleased to call themselves King Council and Queen's Council and this council. Again, the word order and council means made in the name of the monarch. So you have these people appointed to the inner bar in Barbados, right? In the inner bar in Barbados, right? Carrying these designations of King Council and Queen's Council and this council, being representatives of the monarch, right? You will more than likely never see any of them ever attempting to open that form of communication to say, well, Let us look at the colonial laws which are still on the books of Barbados, and let's just look at having serious constitutional reform and serious law reform. Because as I said, it is not only Barbados that has this challenge, it is down to the Caribbean that has this problem that I am speaking about. The maintenance of the savings law clause on their books. And the fact that those persons who took these Caribbean countries to republic fell short. They fell short. Right? They fell short at the time in fully liberating the Caribbean from out under British West Indian rule. Because upwards to today, you could clearly see by the legislation that I showed you guys that these laws are still very much on the books. These laws were never repealed. These laws to control the Caribbean were never repealed. They're still on the books. Right? You still have Caribbean countries today who have governor generals in their country. You still have Caribbean countries today that are part of the British Commonwealth. Right? So we boast about being a proud Barbadian, and we boast about being a proud Trinidadian, and we boast about being a proud Jamaican. But realistically, that is part of the British colonial legacy. Right? These Caribbean countries, colonies. Right? So, in attempting to rewrite history or to change history, this idea of going to republic and breaking away from the Queen is but mere semantic. Right? It's but mere semantic because all that is different, or all that is different in Barbados, I should say, is that they changed or amended the so-called constitution to say no that where you saw governor general is no president. That is all. But all of the colonial laws are still on the books. And I don't see any of these persons within the inner bar carrying the same colonial titles on their names. Right? Using these same colonial titles on their names, I don't see any of them. Period. Really going the route of attempting to revolutionize the constitutional affairs of Barbados, and I dare say revolutionize the constitutional affairs of the Caribbean, and to revolutionize the constitutional affairs of former colonies of Britain. So, with Britain attempting in late years to exit the European Union and to try to regain some type of status in the world, right? Countries go republic is but the least of their worries. Go ahead, go republic. It doesn't matter to them because your parliaments are literally tied to the Commonwealth and tied to the British via the maintenance of these savings law clauses. So you can have, I support a president, I support voting for a president. In Barbados, I think that's the way we need to go. However, deeper reform needs to occur past just having a ceremonial president, right? So to move back on track here, right? To move back on track here, right? So Square Four is asking the question. Square Four is saying, Kemar, how I understand it. From independent Mr. Barrow and the late Queen sit down and did certain things that ties Barbados to Britain, regardless of independence or not. So we can't be no true republic. So this is basically the gist of what I am trying to say. Right? This is basically the gist of what I am trying to say. We can't be a true republic, similar to how America is a republic. We can't have true Republican status if we continue to maintain the savings law clauses on the books, right? Unless the Parliament of Barbados passes its own constitution, right? Passes its own constitution, and that's something I have to break down for you guys because what they did in 2021 was so weird, right? What they did was so weird in 2021. I need to expound upon it. Because what Franklin attempted many times to explain it to the public, right? Because he was in the Senate at the time that they passed the Barbados Constitution Amendment Act 2021 to transition over to republic. So we're gonna get into that, right? We're gonna get into that. So this Independence Act, right? This Independence Act, I think we're done quoting from here now. I showed you guys the Barbados Constitution already. Right? So this legislation, right? This legislation then gave rise to what you call, I just say the more modern courts that we have. Remember Barbados said, Barbados said if you want, eh, if you want justice, do the law courts. No, that was a very powerful statement that he made, right? Because Barrow helped right, to conceptualize what the local court system would be like. So again, the local court system is dominated by attorneys, who all aspire to be part of the inner bar, right? Who all aspire to be part of the inner bar, again having the titles of the Queen, and all of our prime ministers, with the exception of Owen Alpha and Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford, were Queen's Counsel. So Barrow, he was a Queen's Counsel. Uh, Tom Adams, I think he was a Queen's Counsel as well. Breeze, Bernard St. John, uh, think so as well. David Thompson, Mia Motley, Brandon Stewart, all attorneys, all Queen's Counsel, QCs, right? So most of the legislation um, will still have the Queen's representative here, right? Meaning the Governor General. And you can recall that the Prime Minister said that there's no reason why we should not go to Republic, and there's no reason why we should still be going out to England. We should still be going out to England to have certain things approved. There were certain things, basic things approved or not. And that was one of the reasons for us going to Republic because of that reference to England. right? So when Barbados went to when Barbados went to republic, when Barbados went to republic, remember we no longer have the Queen's representative from England in the Governor General. We now have a president, a Barbadian head of state, and we are still so-called or moving on to so-called republic. Right? We are moving on to republic, right? With a Barbadian head of state, i.e., the president. But how they tricked us is that the Parliament of Barbados picks the president. So the people have no say in Westminster politics in Barbados. So the people don't choose the prime minister or the people don't choose the president. Both are selected by the Parliament of Barbados, and the Parliament of Barbados directly receives its power, right? The Parliament of Barbados directly receives its power from that act, the Barbados Independence, right? The Barbados Independence Act of 1966 passed in the British Parliament, which gave the modern Barbados Parliament its power, right? So let us look now at how, oh, before I forget something, before I get there, after Barbados, right, went to independent status, 1966, and the what was say the crushing, right, the crushing of the federation. Barrow then took Barbados into what you call the Organization of American States, right, or we call the OAS. So let me pull it up here for you people as usual. It says here that Barbados joined the Organization of American States in 1967, shortly after achieving independent status. And the Organization of American States is a regional organization that promotes cooperation among member states in the Americas, and Barbados has actively participated in the Organization of American States since joining, particularly in matters related to regional integration and development, right? And development. So let me go on to what the OAS is saying, right? Remember, Federation crash, Barrow war government in 1966, and Barrow is taking us up to, Barrow is taking us up to the OAS by 1967, and Barbados joins the Organization for of American States. So let's look at who are the members. Let's look at who are the members of the Organization of American States. Right? Remember, Barrow, 1967. So on the OAS's website, right? Let me just show you this. Let me show you this. This is very important. After Federation crashed, Barbados by 1967 joined the Organization of American States. Right? Remember, Federation was an act of the British Parliament, right? An act of the British Parliament, the British Federation. That crash, because Jamaica left, then Trinidad left, and it tumbled. And then later on, they passed the West Indies Act, which gave rise to the different Caribbean countries achieving independence. And Barbados taking independence in 1966. That by 1967, we are part of this OAS, Organization of American States. So here are the countries. Here are the countries: Antigua and Barbuda, Argentina, Barbados, Belize, Bolivia, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Cuba, Dominica, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Grenada, Guatemala, Guyana, Haiti, Honduras, Jamaica, Mexico, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Suriname, the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago, the United States of America, Uruguay, and Venezuela. So, what is significant, right? What is significant about the OAS? Federation didn't work, right? So we went into the Organization of American States. So now we're on their website. Let us click about the OAS, right? Say they want to give us some history. Let us look at their history. Now, this is a lot to read here, right? But for those persons who are interested, for those persons who are interested, you can go and look for the charter. You can go and look for the charter of the Organization of American States, right? Now, let me just say this: any country or any possibility of a coup happening in Barbados, the OAS reserves the right to refuse to acknowledge any government that was taken over by a coup. Okay? So if there's the possibility of unfair elections, if there's the possibility of vote rigging, and if there's the possibility of a coup taking over in Barbados or any of these member countries, then the OAS reserves the right not to recognize that government. So y'all can recall when Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, in the circumstances where the opposition leader Juan Guaido was saying that he was the winner, and then Maduro was saying that he was the winner, and then the OAS and a couple of OAS states were coming out saying that we should recognize Guaido, and it was a whole back and forth banter. Right? Included within the charter is the right not to recognize what they call a legitimate government. But who's to determine if a government is legit or illegitimate? So these are just some of the mandates of the OAS, really and truly. So fast forward past that, there was the uh, fast forward past that, then there was CARICOM, the Treaty of Chaguaramas, and the establishment of what we call CARICOM. But you can clearly see that CARICOM is such an effective tool at tackling regional integration, and CARICOM has no real political power. So Caribbean leaders come to CARICOM, they all agree on something, and then when they get back home, to hell with what they just agreed to at the level of CARICOM. Right? To hell with what they agreed to at the level of CARICOM. So CARICOM is ineffective. And CARICOM is only achieving the flight of capital and the movement of money to different Caribbean countries depending on who has certain things going on at the time. But there's no real political bind to get the CARICOM nation states to actually agree to measures and actually implement them. So I would go as far as to say that CARICOM needs revamping. I won't go and say abolish, but it needs revamping because it is ineffective and it does not suit the times. So it needs to be revamped to a more modern and effective way of doing life in the Caribbean. CARICOM, the Treaty of Sagamores, it needs to be visited. So for those Caribbean leaders who are listening, maybe Andrew Holness of Jamaica is listening. Maybe Mr. Gaston Brown is listening. Maybe Mr. Decon Mitchell of Grenada is listening. Maybe Irfan Ali of Guyana, he's listening. So I am saying to the Caribbean leaders, head on up to Mr. Fasad, Mr. Cesar in Trinidad and make an attempt to review and revisit the Treaty of Chaguaramas, or what we call CARICOM, and make it more effective to a more modern and more progressive Caribbean. Right? So, since you're part of the Caribbean Progress Studies Institute, we focus on our regional brothers and sisters. So, the Treaty of Chaguaramas, the CARICOM, in order to have Caribbean progress, right? In order to have Caribbean progress, the metric or the governance structure, right, or the governance structure of CARICOM needs to be revisited and it needs to be changed. So the same way how the British Federation collapsed, right? The same way how it collapsed for the same reason CARICOM is collapsing and not working, it will soon come a time where the entire institution of CARICOM collapses if we don't do anything to ensure that it works. The same way how Federation collapsed. And that's highly possible and practical right now, given the fact that Caribbean countries are going after their own specific interests. Prime example, Barbados supports the One China policy. St. Vincent and the Grenadines and St. Lucia, they recognize Taiwan. They don't recognize the One China policy. But still, we're a Caribbean region, right? So issues simply like China and America, we can't agree on. So what's it sense of having this CARICOM metric if simple things we can't agree on? So that needs to be revisited. Now, let me take a couple of comments before we uh jump into the last half hour of alternate views. So we're coming up at 10. We were going for quite a while. So I want to thank you all for coming on. So shout out to Tyrone Nurse, Pedro Gemma, Anthony Oliver, Fabian Yard, Square 4, Tyrone Nurse, Patrick Designs, Mr. Angel, Lemuel Tell, Shirlene Clark. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Uh, we had someone on here named Rico Brown who said Kemar Stuart for his church essential needs a good MP. Well, we find a good MP for Christ Church essential to run for the New National Party, because that is the party that we support. We don't support BLP or DLP. But Kemar Stuart is seeking to contest the St. John constituency. So shout outs to everybody on the live in the St. John constituency. However, tonight is not political night. This is professional night, and we have to keep it professional because that is the mandate of the show to discuss economic issues from different perspectives: the perspective of the law, perspective of finance, perspective of medicine and medical. So different perspectives on economic issues. That is what alternative views is for. Tuesdays, that's political night. So yeah, as I was saying here, Barbados in 2021, right? Barbados in 2021 December, after being promised a referendum on republic, we went to republic without a referendum. Right? So let me show you the legislation. Let me show you the legislation which would take Barbados onto a republic. Right? So it says here that let me go out to the name, make sure to get the name for you. That this bill would alter the constitution in order. This bill would alter the constitution in order here to provide. Hold a second. We're having a quick glitch here. Just 1 second, please. Yes. So that glitch should be fixed now. So this, what you can see here on the screen, says that this bill would alter the constitution in order A, to provide for Barbados to become a republic with a president who shall be the head of state of Barbados, and B, to provide for related matters. Right? So we remember we discussed the history of the constitution, where it came from, how it was derived, etc. So we don't need to go over that again. So that constitution, right, that was placed within the schedule, right, of the 1966 independence order, right, this says here now that this bill would alter that constitution and provide for Barbados to become a republic with a president who shall be a head of state. Right? So let us move past that. Right? It goes on to say here, part one, savings and transitional provisions related to Barbados becoming a republic. Now, y'all can remember that included in the Barbados Independence Order of 1966. Right? It says that the legislature or the parliament, right, could provide a bill or an act or amendment or so which would speak to the transitional nature of government. At that specific time, it was speaking to the transitional nature of moving from a colony over to independence. And now the transition now that they're speaking about here is moving from governor general over to presidency. Right? So This says here, and it gives again short title, interpretation, the appointed day, the Constitution of Barbados, existing law, prerogative and privilege, legal proceedings, and you can see it all there. You don't need to repeat it. You can see it all. Right? So this gives the amendments for the alteration of the Constitution, right? So it says here, let us count. So that is 28. That's eight different amendments. So eight different amendments were laid in the Parliament of Barbados. Right? Eight different amendments were laid in the Parliament of Barbados to transition Barbados over to Republic. Right? Eight different. So you can see those on there. In the interest of time, we're not going to read through. Well, sorry, it's not eight. It's actually 10 different amendments. Sorry. Because I didn't see these two here. So it's 10 different amendments to transition over to Republic. So this bill here that we are reading, there is the transition bill. So let us read what it says. So it says Barbados, a bill entitled An Act to Alter the Constitution in order for Barbados to become a republic with a head of state. It then goes on to say that whereas Section 49 of the Constitution provides that Parliament may, by an act of Parliament passed by both houses, alter the Constitution. So yes, you can alter the Constitution as far back as 1966, but you can't alter nothing. Um, the colonial laws, right? You can't alter the colonial laws per se. So calm down, calm down, calm down. It says savings and transitional provisions relating to Barbados becoming a republic. This act may be cited as the Constitution Amendment Act number 2, Act 2021. And the different interpretation, it says the appointed day, which knows we went through what the appointed day was previously. It says the existing law, meaning any laws having effect as part of the law of Barbados immediately before the appointed day, including any law made before the appointed day and coming to operation on or before that day. Right? And then it references again Independence Order, meaning the Barbados Independence Order of 1966. Okay, so let us come up. Let us come up. Ah, it then goes on to say here that the Independence Order, right? The Independence Order is revoked. Right? Remember we passed the independence, right? Pedro said thought you can alter law once granted permission. You could alter law after 1966, but based off the provisions in the Independence Order, um, you cannot alter laws made before the appointed day in 1966. You could alter the laws made after the appointed day, which is November 30th, 1966. You can make them. You can alter them after. Right? You can alter laws which were passed after. Right? So remember, Barbados never passed an actual document and put it in the parliament and said, well, look, this is the Constitution of Barbados and let me vote for it. The independence order was passed in the Parliament of Barbados. Right? So it never told to say that the independence order is revoked, but the revocation of that order shall not affect the validity of the Constitution settled in the schedule to that order. Right? It says that the revocation of that order shall not affect the validity of the Constitution settled in the schedule to that order. So, in answering the question, does Barbados have a constitution or not? Here is clearly your answer. The independence order is revoked. However, the revocation of that order shall not affect the validity of the constitution settled in the schedule of that order. So remember, I told you guys that the Barbados constitution was settled, right? Was settled in the schedule of the Barbados Independence Order of 1966. Barbados didn't necessarily pass the constitution, they passed the order, and the constitution was included in the schedule in that order, right? So the order was revoked, but this constitutional amendment says that the constitution and its validity is not impacted whatsoever. So there is a constitution based off this, but there's no longer the Barbados Independence Order sitting on our books. Right? That was repealed according to these constitutional amendment act. Right? So Pedro is asking, let's look at the buggery law. No, it could be repealed, but in reverse, do you see any law being passed since then which actually legalizes it? Right? So it's one thing for a local court to strike down a law, like a judge could argue that the law could be struck down, but then Parliament then has to come and rectify that. Judges don't make the law, judges interpret the law, right? So a judge could interpret a law to be unjust and unfitting based off the times, but Parliament they are the ones who have to rectify that. Right? So yes, the law would have been struck down. Yes, the law would have been struck down, but you haven't seen anything passed which actually legalizes what was just repealed and putting it in black and white saying, well, this is not the case. No, actually partnership law is just that, like a civil union. It still doesn't legalize the act of buggery. Right? So you could be in a legal union, but the act of legally, legally doing what these two people will be doing, no, it still isn't there. So, right? So the position still holds. So it then goes on to say here that the Constitution referred to in Section 1, right, shall be altered in accordance with the provisions of Section 49 thereof in a manner and to the extent settled in this Act. And on the appointed day, the Constitution, as so altered, shall become the Constitution and supreme law of Barbados. So there is a Constitution of Barbados, right? There is a Constitution of Barbados based off what we can see here in this Constitutional Amendment Act, right? So I'm not an attorney, so maybe somebody could come and clarify for me if you could revoke the order and not the schedule, or if you revoke one, you gotta revoke all two, or you can revoke one and not in next. I'm not an attorney, so I can't answer that question. But the Parliament of Barbados said that they revoked the independence order, but they kept the constitution that is contained within the schedule, which is contained within that order. So that was probably one of the Queen's councils or the King's councils or one of these persons with the status could come and explain it to the public exactly what happened here. So then it goes on to say again about the existing law. And it says, subject to this subsection, the operation of the existing law on and after the appointed day shall not be affected by the revocation of the independence order, but the existing law shall be construed with such modifications, adaptations, qualifications, and exceptions as may be necessary to bring existing law into conformity with the Constitution. Right? So it clearly shows you here, Pedro, again, how the same colonial slave laws continue to exist. So I'm going to repeat that for you again. Subject to this section, the operation of the existing law on and after the appointed day shall not be affected by the revocation of the independence order, but the existing law shall be construed with such modifications, adaptations, qualifications, and exceptions as may be necessary to bring the law into conformity with the Constitution. Right? So there is it again, the savings law clause. So I want to get to the part here that says now about president. So it said any reference to Her Majesty the Queen, whether or not that expression is used, or to the crown, or to the sovereign, shall be read and construed as if it were a reference to the state. Any reference to the Governor General shall be read and construed as if it were a reference to the President of Barbados. Any reference to Crown lands shall be read and construed as a reference to state lands, and any reference to Her Majesty's dominion shall be read and construed as a reference to the Commonwealth. Right? Right. So, gonna calm down, calm down, calm down, calm down, calm down, calm down. So, ooh, let us read the election of the first president of Barbados. So it said, in accordance with the provisions of this section, the Prime Minister shall, and the Leader of Opposition may no later than 15th October 2021 nominate a person to be elected as the President of Barbados. That person ended up to be Sandra Mason. If the Prime Minister and Leader of Opposition make in writing to the Speaker a joint nomination of a qualified candidate for election of President, be a nomination to which the candidate has consented, the Speaker shall notify both houses of the joint nomination at a joint meeting of both houses, and the Speaker shall ask the members whether any member has an objection to the candidate being declared duly elected, and if no member objects thereto, the Speaker shall declare the candidate duly elected. And this needs to change because the people of Barbados should be voting for whoever is the president. Right? So Guyana is much further than this as it relates to the office of presidency, and they actually vote for who becomes their president. So this is how they elected the first president, but we don't want that because our president has been in for a while. Right? I am trying to get to the part which speaks to uh here is it. It says here that the president, office of president and head of state, there shall be a president who shall be the head of state. The president shall be the head of the armed forces, and the president shall have such functions assigned as are assigned to him by the Constitution of or any other law. Hey, right. So what disqualifies uh, Sean Cool is asking who is the crown. Well, the crown is now referred to as the state, and the head of state is the president of Barbados. However, as you know, the president is elected by parliament, and parliament right now is full of bees. Right? Parliament is full of bees. So those bees then elected Sandra Mason to become the president. But there's clauses within the constitution that the parliamentarians could remove the president. Right? So the president still has to walk a tightrope, a type of way, because parliament still maintains overall power. So it was basically a ceremonial changing over, and and the president of Barbados um really and truly sits at the behest of the prime minister, and the prime minister is the person who really and truly controls parliament. As you know, we have a party system, and our current party system says that the Barbados party is in their 30 love. Some technical people would try to say 2091. For me, it ain't no 2091, it's still 30 love. Right? Because the people of Barbados elected 30 Bs to the Parliament of Barbados. And there's still 30 Bs in the House of Parliament today. Right? So, and moving on, right, look at how the president is elected, or the election of president. Right? Whenever the office of president is vacant, or if the term of office of the president is due to expire within not more than 90 days, the Prime Minister shall consult with the Leader of Opposition with a view to their joint nomination of a candidate for election as President. Right? It then goes on here to say that if the Prime Minister and the Leader of Opposition make in writing to the Speaker a joint a, a joint nomination of a qualified candidate for election as president, be a nomination to which the candidate has consented, the Speaker shall notify both houses of that joint nomination. Right? Now, if there are disputes about objections, it speaks to about suspension, if whatever. But that part is not grand, so we can skip past that. It says here, if if the people, or if the Prime Minister and the Leader of Opposition do not within 60 days of a vacancy occurring within the office of President make a joint nomination to the Speaker in accordance with subsection 2, then the Speaker shall notify both houses with a view of holding an election under specific section to fill the vacancy. So if the Prime Minister and Leader of Opposition do not act in accordance with subsection 7, the Speaker notifies both houses, and with that subsection, then the Prime Minister, the Leader of Opposition, and any 10 members of the House of Assembly jointly may each within the period of 14 days after receipt by both houses of a notification on that section, nominate one qualified candidate, be a person who has consented to be nominated. Right? So it shows you again how the houses of parliament have the say, and the houses of parliament are really actually controlled by the prime minister. So Pedro German is saying, and the constitution does not recognize any parties, and that may be intentional. Right? That may be intentional. So we heard the prime minister come out now speaking about regulations for political parties. So maybe we are on the way to having some type of legal stipulations as to how political parties operate, right? Because our system does not recognize them. Our system recognizes independent members of parliament. So this thing about PLP and DLP and you know that becomes totally irrelevant and invalid once you reach the steps of parliament. So yes, I said 30 Bs are in parliament. That is fact because the Barbados Labour Party, the Barbados Labour Party actually um ran the candidates or sponsored the candidates, and then these specific candidates when they get in there, they would agree to hold the philosophy of the party that supported them in there. But there's always freedom of conscience in the Parliament of Barbados. Hence the reason the 30 Bs, one of the 30 Bs was able to cross the floor and claim saying now that he's the opposition. Here what it worked, that he's the opposition. Because the 29 others support the Prime Minister. So all those persons who do not support the Prime Minister, you shall become the opposition. And only one person in the House says that he does not support the Prime Minister. So therefore, that person becomes the opposition leader, right? But it still don't change the fact that 30 people were voting for under the pretense that they were Barbados Party people, right? So that is one of the issues within our system. But I would not blame the system per se. I would say go further, right? Go further and having political parties recognized under the constitution, and therefore you could be able to put a stop to the misuse of the Barbados parliamentary system, right? You could then cut out that misuse and abuse. That you could be elected with a party one day and you miraculously get it and clearly no use the opposition. Poof, just like that. You don't have to answer to anybody. You don't have to go to anybody. You don't got to talk to anybody. You don't got to go back to the people who voted you. Nothing like that, right? And then with the constitution guaranteeing you freedom of assembly and freedom of association, you can then go and join any political party that you want and know that political party has representation in the house, although not contesting um, an election or so, right? So these are things that need to be looked at. If you remember, Maria Eargard crossed the floor and she became the UPP's sole representative in the House, right? And the UPP had a representative through Maria Eargard crossing, right? But I would go as far as to say this. How is it possible that we have subvention rules? Because they heard the opposition leader of Barbados begging, begging the government for a subvention, right? Begging the government for the subvention. So how could Barbados have rules to govern subventions for political parties, but political parties not recognized within our constitution or recognized within our laws? That is an abuse. That's an abuse of our system, right? Political parties are covered nowhere within our laws, but still you have rules that govern how political parties get subvention from the Parliament of Barbados. Explain that to me, right? So until firm legislation comes which recognizes political parties as viable entities, I am saying that nobody should be benefiting from the subvention from government, BLP or DLP, should be benefiting from that subvention unless they go to the House and actually pass the decision which recognizes political parties. Because if you can't recognize them in law, how are they being recognized now to benefit from government money and government subvention? How? Right? I call that playing with people's mind and playing with the law to benefit the party system. So that needs to be fixed. As I was saying here though, um the president. Term of office, because we're gonna wrap up soon anyhow. But the term of office of president. It said a person who has been duly declared elected as president shall under section 32 assume office. If the office is vacant at the time on the next day after the declaration, or if there is an incumbent in office on the next day after the incumbent vacates office, the president shall hold a term for 4 years, right? For 4 years on the day of the president's assumption of office and is eligible for re-election. So Sandra Mason got power in 2021, and this is now 2025, so this is 4 years. So her term is up this year, which means that Barbados will have a new president this year, right? So we need to know or see some signs as to who will become the president later on in the year. So it speaks now to, um, you know, it says here, Parliament may by resolution passed by both houses extend the term of office of president as prescribed by subsection 2 for a period not exceeding 6 months in order to avoid the holding of an election to the office of president. Right? This may happen when Parliament is dissolved or at a time considered by Parliament to be too close to the beginning or the end of a period when Parliament is dissolved. So the president's term can be extended 6 months, right? Right. These are the conditions for removal for the president from office. If he willfully violates the constitution, if he behaves in a way that endangers the security of the state, and for inability to discharge the functions of his office, arising from inability of body, mind, or otherwise, and for misbehavior. Right? Procedure for removal. Uh, all that's quite here. We'll just leave it for you to see. I won't go through it because we are almost out of time. Right. Right. So the oath of presidency is not here. Right. Well, we could come to an end here. I think we covered enough tonight. We could always follow this up. We could always follow this up another time. So thank you guys for yet another Thursday on Alternate Views. I had a very good show. Today was out of my realm. This is actually a legal conversation. I am not a lawyer. I did one law course. That is hospitality law when I was at BCC. Um, but nevertheless, though, I found tonight's discussion to be very eye-opening. We started with the history of it. We came forward to the constitutional amendments, and we actually answered the question: about Barbados having a constitution or not. Right? We went back from 1966 and we showed you how through the Barbados Independence Order being passed in England, and then the Independence Order was passed in Barbados. The Constitution was contained within a schedule, contained within a schedule within that order. Um, we spoke about federation. Spoke about federation crashing. After federation crashing, El Barrow became the first premier. Um, After he became premier, then he took Barbados to independence. And after independence, by 1967, we then joined the Organization of American States. Fast forward, we then attempted to derive what we call CARICOM, which is a modern day uh, British Act. You know, the British West Indies or the West Indies Act, which gave these Caribbean countries independence, right? And then the British Federation Act, right, which attempted to bring political unions to Caribbean countries. So that British Federation Act morphed into what is now CARICOM and the Treaty of Chaguaramas. So the capital for federation was in Trinidad. The Treaty of Chaguaramas was centered in Trinidad, in and around Trinidad as well. But I said CARICOM is ineffective and needs to be revisited. So fast forward, Barbados going a step further in establishing a republic. So the question came up when the independence order was revoked, did it make the constitution null and void? We read the Barbados Constitutional Amendments Act of 2021 and it clearly says that the independence order was revoked. The independence order was revoked. However, it did not impact the constitution that was contained in the schedule of that order, right? And then it also went on to say that any existing laws which occurred before the appointed day could then be brought into being to connect with, not to connect with modern and existing laws. Notwithstanding the savings law clause, which keeps most of the colonial laws on the books, and the chances of altering these, not altering, the chances of changing these colonial laws based off the old orders we have, right? Based off the old orders we have, um, it will be quite difficult to have those changes. So with the suspension, so with the republic and the suspension of the order, maybe it would give us some scope as Caribbean governments and Caribbean leaders. It would give us some scope to actually do the deep restructuring of the history of Barbados, and as it relates to our constitutional affairs. So we dealt with the office of president of Barbados. What it's like. We're due a new president this year. Right, we're due a new president this year. But Guyana being the only country in this side of the hemisphere that votes for a president, I would like Barbados to also go the route of voting for a president. I will also love for the other Caribbean countries throughout the region to step out to this independence thing and go into a republic, right? Go into a republic, but also let us come together as Caribbean leaders and say we want to revisit CARICOM, right? And we also want to revisit this savings law clause that continues to be maintained on the law books of former colonies of the United Kingdom. Yeah. So that was a recap of all we went through tonight. So if you want, you can go back and watch this show. You can go back and watch this show tonight. It was very interesting, great historical context, great futuristic context, as well as the direction we want to go. That's the direction we want to go. So let me just take in a few comments and then we're going to sign off because it's definitely getting late. It is past 10. Um, so yeah, we have Sheepdog all the way from Ireland. So welcome on to all of the Irish reviewing what is happening over there in Ireland with the immigration crisis and the different crises happening. So it is good to have Sheepdog and all the others from Ireland on. So good night to you and good night to everyone else over that side of the world. Good evening to all of the viewers over in Africa as well. Ethiopia and Ghana and Senegal and you know Burkina Faso. So good night to you. Good night to all of our international audience. So good night to you, Sheepdog. Bye. So Pedro, you mentioned with the CCJ, as I said earlier, the CCJ is Frondo Stewart, former Prime Minister, said that if in 2018 he said that if Barbados had to, or if the Democratic Labour Party had to win the government, that Barbados will no longer be a member of the Caribbean Court of Justice. That is what Mr. Stewart said, right? But there are other countries in the Caribbean that does not recognize the Caribbean Court of Justice as its final court of appeal. Jamaica just went to the Privy Council. Vibes Cartel just took a case to the Privy Council. Right? So the Caribbean is not together, even as it relates to a final court of appeal. So that's why I'm saying CARICOM needs to be visited. We can't even agree on a single court. Right? We can't even have a similar currency. Right? When we have meetings, we don't have meetings as a regional block in most instances. Individual countries meet with individual leaders and we do individual things. And for example, again, Barbados agrees with the one China policy, while St. Vincent and St. Lucia does not recognize the one China policy. They support Taiwan. So again, we are not together as a region on these issues. So yes. Adrian Bascom is saying, I want to hear you on the latest move with the IMF. I addressed this extensively. I addressed this topic extensively more than once. So unfortunately, no, I will not be addressing this issue. Um, yeah. So unfortunately, will not be addressing any issues tonight to do with the IMF or the late tonight is about the constitution of Barbados. I think we spoke so many times about the IMF. In my press conference held on Saturday, held on Saturday for the new national party, we extensively spoke to the IMF. So just go on to our page and watch the entire press conference, and you will fully get our opinions and our thoughts on the IMF. So yeah, so thank you guys very much for tuning on. The numbers are not growing as we are about to sign off, but nevertheless, thank you guys very much. I hope this was a beneficial conversation to you. I enjoyed sharing with you tonight. So I want to encourage you all to come in next week. Look out for next week Tuesday, which is political Tuesdays. Um, just type in NMP press conference, NMP Barbados press conference. You can also go on the Alternate Views YouTube page and click live videos, and you will definitely see the press conference popping up. And we spoke extensively to the International Monetary Fund and about this arrangement of this speed deal arrangement. Economist Anthony Wood spoke extensively on it as well, and I am hearing some other people, which is so strange because both the Prime Minister, right, and the opposition leader of Barbados, they are both briefed. They are both briefed by the IMF, right? So I know you don't really get the information you're looking for from these players. However, alternate views is just alternate views, and if you want that level of conversation, you have to go over to You have to go over to the NFP. No, these things are not secret, Pedro, so don't try to act as though they're secret. Um, these things happen all over the world. These are everyday things that happen. Right? These are things that happen. So just not spoken about. But these are things that happen every day, and they are not secret. The IMF is a transparent institution to a point, and most of the things that I say about the institution are all public documents, and are all public documents produced by the IMF. Right? So you will see that the IMF says, well, we spoke to the authorities, and the authorities meaning the Minister of Finance, the Prime Minister, and the opposition leader. So that's no secret. Right? So if you become opposition leader tomorrow, Pedro, they will speak to you as well. The private sector speaks to you. The union speaks to you because the opposition is often seen as like a prime minister in waiting. Right? So these things happen naturally. However, they are just not spoken about in Barbados, and there are no secrets, so no need to fear about rabbit hole or no need to fear about what is public information. Yes. So thank you guys again very much. Thank you guys very much. Hey, um, for tuning in. Right. So thank you guys. Mr. Bascom, go and watch the shows, alternate views. We did an entire show on devaluation. So go and watch the shows. All of them are online. All of them are online. Alternate views on YouTube. Watch the videos. We constantly speak about these things every week. Every week we speak. We did an entire show on the devaluation of the Barbados dollar, dollarization of the Barbados dollar, the depreciation of the Barbados dollar. All of that information is on the stream. But guys, thank you all. Sheepdog, good to see you. Square 4, Tyrone Nurse, Pedro Gemma, Mr. Angel, Lemuel Tell, Asia Bascom, Evolving. Uh, thank you. Square 4. Everyone, just thank you for tuning on tonight. We are at the end, and I am definitely out of here. So I will see you guys on Tuesday for Political Tuesdays, and then we're back here again at Alternate Views next week. So, goodbye.